Hello, it is I, Montemayor, reporting to you from the battlefield of Leuthen, where over 2.5 centuries ago, Frederick the Great obtained one of the greatest military victories of his career. And I am standing where Frederick was that historic morning while doing his personal reconnaissance. In front of him lay an imposing Austrian army, numerically superior to his. Moreover, that same army, the last time he had encountered them 6 months previously, they had defeated him on the field. So this was not going to be an easy task. He is outnumbered, facing a formidable challenger, and worse yet, he's on the tactical offensive. He has to attack them. Undaunted, Frederick was determined to seek nothing less than the absolute destruction of that enemy. The question was, how was he going to do it? Well, the plan he creates while on this hill is what would take his army to victory despite the odds, and what would establish his legacy as being one of history's greatest military commanders. This is a story of Frederick the Great's brilliant victory at Leuthen. The tough situation Frederick found himself in the winter of 1757 was all of his own making, and is centered on his recent ambitions on Silesia, dating back over 15 years. Maria Theresa ascended the Austrian throne in 1740, and the uncertainty that followed gave Frederick an opportunity to seize the richest province of the Habsburg monarchy. In the following First and Second Silesian Wars, the Prussians achieved a complete series of victories over the Austrian troops and successfully defended their new territorial gains. In the resulting peace treaty of 1745, Maria Theresa had no choice but to acknowledge the loss of Silesia. Frederick greatly benefited from this opportunistic land grab. Silesia was rich in agriculture and mineral resources, had a flourishing textile industry, and had increased Prussia's population by more than a third. Furthermore, it brought prestige to the Kingdom of Prussia and established it among the ranks of the major powers of the continent. A decade later, war was on the horizon, as hostilities were breaking out between Britain and France. Everyone knew it was a matter of time before war spread to the continent, and as a result, everyone began making alliances. For Maria Theresa, this would be her chance for revenge, as Frederick's treachery had not been forgotten. Austria formed a grand anti-Prussian coalition that included Russia and France on her side. Her goals were to retake Silesia and punish the upstart king by bringing Prussia back to its second-rate status. Prussia, for all her efforts, was only successful in getting Great Britain and Hanover on her side. By the spring of 1756, Frederick could see the writing on the wall. His enemies were mobilizing and getting ready to take offensive action against his small kingdom. Frederick was even under the mistaken belief that nearby Saxony would join the anti-Prussian camp. Not being a man of inaction, nor one to leave matters to run its course, Frederick decided on a preemptive strike to steal the initiative from the coalition. By the summer of that same year, the 7 Years' War had begun in Europe, engulfing all of the major powers. For Frederick's part, however, he would invade Saxony, sparking the Third Silesian War. The war began reasonably well for Frederick. He overran and occupied Saxony and defeated an Austrian force at Lobositz. The following spring saw Frederick launch a full-scale invasion of Bohemia and defeat an Austrian army outside of Prague. The battered army under Prince Charles of Lorraine withdrew to the city, which Frederick placed under siege. Things were looking good. If this army surrendered along with the city, maybe peace with Vienna could be discussed on favorable terms. However, by this point, Frederick had made an ominous assessment. These Austrians weren't the same from the previous war. They had shown tenacity in their defense, skilled maneuvering, and above all, a newfound confidence. Although Lobositz and Prague had been victories, they had been costly ones. Frederick couldn't afford such losses, especially given Prussia's limited manpower and resources. What Frederick was anxiously noticing was the result of the admirable efforts of Maria Theresa and her generals to improve the Austrian army during the interim peace years. These reforms included updated regulations and training for the infantry and cavalry, the introduction of a modernized artillery system, and the founding of a military academy for future aspiring officers. Understandably, not all of these extensive reforms had been completed before the outbreak of war, but, as Frederick had noticed, enough progress had been made to make an impact on the battlefield. So here's where things take a sudden and shocking turn for the Prussians. Field Marshal Leopold von Daun assembled an army to relieve the siege of Prague. Frederick set off to confront Daun, they met at Kolin, and, against all expectations, Daun won and defeated Frederick, the first defeat in Frederick's military career. The Prussian army withdrew, lifted the siege of Prague, and sought safety inside of Saxony. It had been a stunning reversal to an otherwise successful campaign. This painting, I believe, captures most accurately the despair Frederick must have been experiencing. He must have been thinking to himself, what now? It goes without saying that this was a low point for the Prussian army in terms of morale and outlook for the future. So, if one ever wanted to see a bleak and disheartening strategic picture for combatant, one need not look further than what Frederick faced in the autumn of 1757. In the south was a 100,000-strong Austrian army, revitalized by their recent victory and poised to enter Saxony. In the east, the Russian army had defeated a small Prussian force at the Battle of Gross-Jägersdorf. The Swedes had entered the coalition, and their 20,000 men are now posing a threat to Pomerania. And a Franco-Imperial army had already crossed the Rhine and was marching east to liberate Saxony from Prussian occupation. As can be seen, he is surrounded on all sides and in a seemingly hopeless position. Nevertheless, the last thing Frederick would ever do would be to relinquish the strategic initiative to his adversaries. If there's one thing he has going for him, it's the advantage of fighting on interior lines. His enemies, apart from Austria, have to fight far from their homeland. This means the coalition would find it hard, as it would later continuously be proven, to coordinate their actions together. Thus, Frederick has a chance. If he kept a cool head, he could wait until one of them approached within operational range, and then he could strike out and defeat that opponent before counter-marching to defeat another one. In essence, he can focus on his enemies one at a time. This strategy will be shown spectacularly before the year is out. Frederick would not have to wait long for an opportunity to take the initiative. The Austrian army on his southern front was showing their usual signs of lethargy, presenting Frederick with a window of opportunity to first deal with the French contingent. He left a screening force to watch over the Austrians, while he took 22,000 men west to Thuringia. Frederick marched his army 170 miles in 2 weeks, an impressive achievement by those standards. He made contact with the Franco-Imperial army, but they held strong defensive ground, dissuading Frederick from attacking. Frederick tried to lure them out into the open where he could have better odds, but to no avail. After weeks of squaring off, the two forces finally came to blows near a small village named Rossbach. Now, Rossbach deserves a video of its own, and honestly, not to take anything away from Leuthen, this one here is his actual masterpiece. Outnumbered 2-1, Frederick unleashed a devastating defeat on the Franco-Imperial army. They lost more than 5,000 men, while Prussia suffered only 548 casualties, a nearly 10-to-1 ratio. Adding to this achievement was an impressive prisoner haul of 5,000 Allied troops captured. It was such an unquestionable debacle for the French that for the rest of the war they would never venture this far east again. Despite the odds, Frederick had triumphed, and the victory had restored the reputation of the Prussian army. However, as great as all of this was, it wouldn't be enough to turn his perilous strategic picture around. For, as he was campaigning gloriously in the west, things weren't going so well back home. We welcome into this epic the victorious, confident, new and improved Austrian army. While Frederick was away on his campaign against the French, the Austrians took notice of the fact and seized the moment by launching an amazing strategic offensive. They fell upon an isolated small Prussian corps and were victorious over them at the Battle of Moise. The main Prussian army defending the region, under the Duke of Bevern, hastily retreated to Breslau, the provincial capital of Silesia. The Austrians followed this success up with a bold and daring raid on Berlin, conquering the modern fortress of Schweidnitz, and inflicting a resounding defeat on Bevern's army outside of Breslau. The commander was captured, the remnants of the battered army fled across the Oder, and Breslau, the prized city, fell into Austrian hands. What an impressive campaign! All these actions speak to the competency and strength of the reformed Austrian army. This is the challenger that awaits Frederick should he attempt to recapture Silesia. Now is a good time to introduce the commander of this seemingly unstoppable Austrian army. After Field Marshal Daun rescued Prince Charles's besieged army at Prague, royal hierarchy would resume its role. Charles, as prince and brother-in-law to Maria Theresa, would always be placed in higher command, with Daun relegated as his number 2. Prince Charles of Lorraine was personally brave and popular enough with his troops. Although he had a long military record, it was a less than illustrious one. He tended to find success only when he had good advisors by his side. And I'd be remiss not to mention that he had encountered Frederick before and had lost every engagement against the king. An overly cautious leader, he lacked self-confidence, was known to quarrel with his officers, and displayed traits of indifference and irresponsibility. The main takeaway here is that we have in effect a dual command. We have a mediocre, aristocratic commander, and on the other hand, Daun, the professional, methodical advisor, whose advice would frequently be ignored. One thing the two have in common is that they are both defensively minded. Both Charles and Daun were proud of their successful campaign, and would have been glad to end it on such a high note. Unfortunately, their high spirits were cut short when reports came in that Frederick's little army was marching towards them. Again, the marching abilities of the Prussian infantry were on full display. 190 miles in 15 days. They reached Parchwitz by the end of November. By now, the terrible news of the fall of Breslau had arrived, and it dawned on Frederick the brutal fight that awaited. Most likely, he would have to storm Breslau and its strong defenses. It would undoubtedly be a bloody battle where victory did not seem likely. And this is why I find this campaign and the upcoming Battle of Leuthen so captivating. Apart from the fact that this legendary clash will take place in the snow, that in my opinion gives it a dramatic aesthetic feel, it's how high the stakes were. Frederick couldn't allow the enemy to keep Silesia for the winter. They would consolidate their hold there, denying him the revenue, resources, and men of that region, and come spring, they would have a springboard for future offensives into his kingdom. Adding to the urgency is that time was running out, as winter was soon to begin, spelling an end to the campaigning season. Therefore, it's all or nothing. Despite the odds stacked against him, he had to try. Whoever kept Silesia for the winter could decide the war. As he disclosed to a friend, "I must attempt and achieve the impossible, for the salvation of the state is in the balance." It was Frederick's subsequent actions at the Parchwitz camp that helped give rise to the legend of Old Fritz, the name by which his soldiers would come to know him affectionately. In rather unusual behavior, the stoic king was seen walking around the camp and interacting with his men. Remnants of the Duke of Bevern's army gradually reappeared and reintegrated themselves into Frederick's camp, giving his army a welcome boost to their numbers. To their surprise, they were not chastised for their failure to protect Breslau. Instead, they were encouraged to listen to the stories from the victors of Rossbach around the campfires. Extra rations and liquor were distributed among the soldiers, and promotions were promised. In short, Frederick was letting them know future conduct would cleanse past records. What Frederick was wisely doing here was lifting the spirits of his men. He still needed them for one more fight. With the ranks inspired, he turned to his officers. There are many artistic depictions of the Parchwitz Address, all equally giving it justice to the legendary event. In comes Frederick in his familiar tattered old uniform, his somber demeanor no doubt revealing the uphill struggle that lays ahead. Of note, he gave this memorable speech in German, no doubt hard for him as he always preferred and felt more comfortable speaking French. What follows deserves to be quoted at length. The enemy hold the same entrenched camp at Breslau which my troops defended so honorably. I am marching to attack this position. I have no need to explain my conduct or why I am set on this measure. I fully recognize the dangers attached to this enterprise, but in my present situation, I must conquer or die. If we go under, all is lost. Bear in mind, gentlemen, that we shall be fighting for our glory, the preservation of our homes, and for our wives and children. Those who think as I do can rest assured that, if they are killed, I will look after their families. If anybody prefers to take his leave, he can have it now, but he will cease to have any claim on my benevolence. And with that, the army was set for the next confrontation. This was probably the most motivated army Frederick would ever lead. True, it was small, but it was composed almost entirely of native Prussians, and most importantly, those that remained were the most loyal, who were ready to stand by their king to the end. Frederick's army set out on December 4th. Riding with his vanguard, they reached the city of Neumarkt and took it by storm after encountering some light resistance. That same evening, the ever-lucky king got the biggest break he could have asked for. Reports from his scouts revealed that the Austrians had left Breslau and were marching west to meet him. Wow, what a relief. This begs the question, why would the Austrians be so foolish to leave the strong defenses of Breslau and go out to engage the Prussians on open ground? The best evidence available suggests that Prince Charles wasn't expecting a battle. On December 2nd, a council of war was established following the unsettling reports that Frederick had reached Parchwitz. The Austrian High Command concluded that they needed to secure the Kotzbach River as it would serve a natural defensive barrier for the upcoming winter quarters of the army. Prince Charles would lead his army to push out whatever bridgehead Frederick had established and secure their side of the riverbank. Hence, Prince Charles was probably expecting some sort of a skirmish or minor clash with whatever small force was at Parchwitz and nothing else. Further indicating that Charles was not expecting a major pitched battle was the fact that he left his heavy artillery behind at Breslau. Moreover, Prince Charles, as others, must have certainly thought, who would be crazy enough to fight a battle now, with the onset of winter? Well, he clearly underestimated the desperation of his opponent, because Frederick would be that crazed man to take up that challenge. With that, the hapless Austrians had proven to be an obliging enemy for Frederick, sparing him from a bloody assault on a fortified city. The army marched west on December 4th. The Habsburg army was in the midst of a river crossing when reports arrived of Frederick's approach. Shocked by the news and aware that battle was near, Prince Charles hastily ordered the men to encamp where they were, which would fatefully center around a small village named Leuthen. December 5th, day of the battle. Prince Charles had with him 55,000 men and 235 pieces of artillery. While the Habsburg army enjoyed the advantage of superior numbers, we must point out that the men were not in the best state for a fight. Many units were depleted by attrition, losses, and sickness after such a long and arduous campaign. The Austrians deployed their men in an extraordinarily long 5.5-mile front. It stretched from the north at Ypern all the way to the south at Saxschutz. By the standards of the time, this would be a large battlefield. For reference, the epic Battle of Waterloo took place on just a 2.5-mile front. Regarding artillery, rather than concentrating it, the Austrians created 5 separate batteries and parceled them out along the line. The main flaw with this deployment is obvious upon looking at it. It's the incredible length of the battle line. Why was this the case? Well, Prince Charles and his staff knew Frederick was fond of flanking attacks, so they reasoned, he can't outflank us if we spread our line long enough. The troubling result was that the front had little depth. But to Prince Charles's credit, he listened to Daun, who suggested the creation of a mobile reserve to contend with any potential breakthroughs. But probably the biggest error they committed, albeit unintentionally, was the following. This was the training ground that Frederick's army would perform its yearly maneuvers on. You can't make this up. They couldn't have chosen a worse spot. So while Frederick and his men were intimately familiar with the terrain, Prince Charles was barely getting acquainted with it, having only arrived the night before. And lastly, to be accurate, there was actually an army and a half here. Prince Charles's army had attached to it an independent corps under the command of a flamboyant and experienced Hungarian hussar, General Franz Leopold Nadezhdy. His corps was composed of the least reliable soldiers because half of them were German contingents of the Holy Roman Empire. The Catholic Bavarians were raw and untried troops, and the Württembergers were mistrusted because they were Protestant like the Prussians and believed to harbor sympathies with them. Expecting Frederick's main attack to fall on the center or northern sector, these troops were placed far away from the expected scene of action to the south at Sachschutz. There, they wouldn't be in anyone's way. Marching from Neumarkt that morning was Frederick's smaller but spirited army of 39,000 men with 167 pieces of artillery. West of Borny was an Austrian screen of Kurots, Hussars, and Saxon light cavalry. The misty fog that morning concealed the approach of Frederick's vanguard, who surprised them and after a short but brutal fight, took possession of the village. The surviving cavalrymen and troops fled to safety behind Austrian lines. With Borny secured, Frederick, along with his staff and escorts, rode to a small hill east of the village named Schonberg. And I am here on that little hill. As you can see, there is a monument that commemorates the battle, which has sadly fallen apart and is crumbling. Well, it's a battle between Prussia and Austria, and since this is now modern-day Poland, it's obvious there's not really an incentive to restore it or maintain it. I mean, that's what I think, at least. Right, so Frederick was here on horseback surveying the battlefield just as the morning fog lifted. But before we continue any further, I wanted to point out some key features of the terrain that one can see when standing on the Schonberg. If we look to the left, that wooded area you see there, that's the Zettelbusch Forest. The Austrian right was behind that. Now looking more towards the center, we can actually see Leuthen itself. It's those 2 church spires you see there. And if we zoom out and look to the right, you can see the terrain is more open and largely unobstructed. But do take note that although it is modest, there is rolling terrain here extending to the south. Alright, so let's see what Frederick's options were that morning and the battle plan he created. From this vantage point, Frederick was able to assess the enemy's positions more clearly. He sees the Austrian army deployed, with its extensive front revealing their immense size. As such, a frontal attack would be foolish, as he is obviously outnumbered. His best option would be to crush one of the 2 enemy wings. But off the bat, he knows an attack on the enemy's right or northern wing would be tricky because of that right there. The Zettelbusch force. It will break up his assault and probably become bogged down. His only hope then is an attack on the enemy's left or southern wing, which soon becomes the most promising option when reports arrive from his scouts with encouraging news. They tell him, Frederick, The enemy's left wing is in the air. The line thankfully stopped short of the ponds and marshes in this region. Thus, there was ample room to maneuver around the flank. Furthermore, as mentioned, Frederick knew this terrain intimately and was aware that a series of low hills ran to the south. He reckoned they could mask a movement in that direction. By 1030, Frederick had created his brilliant plan. His army would conduct a flanking maneuver and attack the Austrian left. He bets on the fact that the small hills of the Schonberg, Schmiedeberg, Schleierberg, Soffenberg, and Wachberg are just tall enough to hide the movement of his troops. This is a risky and complex operation, but if there is anyone who could pull it off, it's the Prussians. There was no better drilled, trained, and agile army than them. But to further ensure the success of this daring enterprise, he needed a distraction his enemy could focus on. So, he ordered 4 battalions and part of his advance guard to stage a demonstration towards the main road. This group made a loud ruckus as they marched towards the Austrian line and even deployed into battle formation, as if getting ready to attack. The enemy took the bait completely. The commander here is General Lucchesi de Verna, a daring leader characterized by his impatience and bravado. Seeing the Prussians advance on his sector, he was convinced an assault was imminent and desperately pleaded for reinforcements. Prince Charles and Daun were reluctant at first. They weren't sure what Frederick was up to. But they ultimately acquiesced after Lucchesi kept sending them message after message. The mobile reserve was released to the north. This mistake was further compounded by sending 4 regiments, nearly half of the left-wing cavalry, in support as well. Daun went personally along with the reinforcements to oversee this so-called threatened sector. The feint by Frederick had worked stupendously. Notice how there is barely any link between the main army and Nadashi's corps, who is now somewhat isolated. Meanwhile, the great flank march around the Austrians had begun. At 1100 hours, the Prussians began wheeling to the right and heading in that direction to the south. Now to the most debated question. Was this grand flanking maneuver truly hidden from Austrian eyes? I ask this because when one visits the battlefield, the first impression they get is that it's pretty level terrain. I mean, where are the hills that are so talked about in this battle? Well, that's them. They are deceptively rolling, rising only a few meters. But that is just high enough to hide a man, which is what matters the most. In 1904, German officers conducted an experiment. They stood on the Breslauer Berg, where Prince Charles was, and had a mounted corporal with a flag follow the same route the Prussians had. And reportedly, the cavalryman disappeared completely from view, confirming that the hills did indeed hide the main body of Frederick's army. So it was quite a fun experience to personally verify this experiment and see the difficulty the Austrians had with my own eyes. I really thought, come on, there had to be a spot where I could get a decent view across the battlefield to where Frederick was at. After all, the terrain looked so unassuming. So I went to where Prince Charles was at during the morning of the battle, here at Breslauer Berg. I am standing where Prince Charles and Field Marshal Daun were at that morning. Now, I wanted to show you their perspective, but I think this area has changed a lot. That tree line you see there and all those buildings weren't there during the battle. From all accounts I've read, they had an unobstructed view standing here. So yeah, sadly it's not historical anymore. So, after that first failed attempt, I went to another location, here, thinking certainly I would be able to see the Schonberg, and, to my surprise, you couldn't see a thing standing here. There's a subtle rise that blocks the view entirely. I would eventually discover that the best location to see anything at all on the other side was on the extreme left part of the Austrian line, like you see here. So, in my final attempt, I went more towards the center of the line in front of Leuthen, and as you will soon see, it was also a failure. I am standing near the center part of the Austrian line. Prince Charles and Field Marshal Daun were on a hill further behind off camera. Now, I brought you guys here because this was the best spot I was able to find, and yet it is very disappointing. Apparently, Schonberg is directly over there, and you can't even see it. Correction. Upon reviewing the footage, I discovered that Schonberg was visible from where I stood. I was just focusing on the wrong spot. But I think my forthcoming analysis still stands. Sure, you can see the monument, but barely the hill itself because it's masked by the rolling terrain. And I'm certain you wouldn't have been able to see the Prussians marching behind the Schonberg. So, the final verdict is, I would say, that the Prussian flank march was hidden from Austrian eyes. However, as the Prussians continued south, glimpses of them were revealed to the Austrians that were on the far left part of the line. Now, these reports did arrive and reach Prince Charles and Field Marshal Daun, but they both came to a mistaken conclusion that would prove fatal. Both Daun and Charles reached the same opinion. The Prussian king was calling it quits. He's seen how big our army is, so he is retiring from the scene, choosing to fight another day. If anything, Charles was probably relieved that he and his weary troops would be spared a battle this day. He does not order any type of intervention on Frederick's apparent flight. Some famous last words were said before the disaster. "Our friends are leaving. Let them go in peace." The Prussian pivot to the southeast occurred in the early afternoon. This was by far the most crucial and challenging phase of the flank march, and it was flawlessly conducted without a hitch. Once the advance guard passed the village of Schrigwitz, they seamlessly fanned out and deployed into battle formation. It's 1 p.m. Look at the tactical picture now. We went from here 2 hours earlier to now here. The entire Prussian army is now facing the Austrians on their exposed flank. From this position, Frederick would now be able to employ his favorite and most well-known tactic, the Oblique Order. Although not an innovation of Frederick's, he perfected it during the 7 Years' War. First, he would show up and after proper reconnaissance, determine which of the enemy's flanks to attack. Once his decision was reached, he would deploy accordingly so the Oblique Order could be attempted. The Oblique Order was when Frederick would strengthen one of his wings and attack in echelon against one of the opponent's wings. A superior concentration of force would fall upon the enemy, gradually increasing until a breakthrough was achieved, in which they could then roll up their line. So, as we can see, at the decisive moment, your attacking wing has achieved local superiority, which was important since Frederick's army was always outnumbered in battles. Meanwhile, the refused part of the line had 3 tasks. They are holding the enemy to their front in place, preventing them from interfering with the breakthrough, and they could either join in the attack when the time came, or, in case the attack failed, serve as a reserve to cover the retreat. A great deal of timing, discipline, and skill was needed for this whole plan to work. But if things went well, it had the potential to achieve decisive results. Now, what could make this tactic even more successful is if before you launched the attack, you could march around the enemy and strike them on their flank, as would be the case in Leuthen. That's what makes Leuthen a unique example of this tactic. A classic attack in oblique order, launched at an angle of nearly 90 degrees against the Austrian left flank. A deadly combination. Aside from the fact that Frederick had managed to get his army to such an advantageous position, with the element of surprise nonetheless, he will be further endowed with an element of luck. They are literally facing the weakest components of the Austrian army. They are facing the independent command of Nadasti, composed of the least reliable German troops. The sudden appearance of the Prussian army in this sector did not go unnoticed. General Nadasti and his men had been watching with great alarm the development occurring right in front of them. So, far from being in the quietest sector of the battlefield, they accurately conclude they would be the main focus of the upcoming attack. Nadasti frantically sent messages to Prince Charles, warning him of the impending assault. He requested the reserves to be sent to him, but it's all in vain as his pleas for help were initially ignored. I am standing in front of where Nadashi's corps would have been. Now, I want you to imagine that you're one of the German auxiliary troops here. This is your perspective. This is what you see. The Prussians are marching across your front from right to left, apparently in retreat. Then they disappear behind that big hill over there near Lobetines, and hidden from your view, that's when they pivot. The next time you start seeing the Prussians again, or glimpses of them, you see that they are now marching on your left. And then, in what must have seemed like an instant, before you could do anything about it, those Prussian columns fan out and deploy into battle formation. You now have a long line of bluecoats facing your vulnerable flank. What a demoralizing sight to have witnessed. It's too late to turn the tide by this point. Frederick's feint had tricked the Austrians into sending their reserves far away to the north. At around this time, Prince Charles only now realized his mistake and belatedly ordered the reserves to march the opposite way. Unfortunately for Nadeshdy, it would take about an hour and 15 minutes for them to get there, a consequence of having a front this long. Frederick reached the vanguard, 3 veteran battalions that were leading the attack, and personally instructed them. Boys, you see the white coats there? You've got to drive them out of the redoubt. All you've got to do is go for them with the bayonet and run them out. I'll support you with 5 grenadier battalions and the whole army. It's win or die. In front of you, you have the enemy, and behind you, you have the whole army, so you can't find room forward or back except as victors. Shortly after 1 p.m., the assault began. The Prussians, with artillery support right behind them and cavalry guarding their flank, fell upon the Württembergers. They stood their ground at first, but as expected, these Protestants weren't so gung-ho about fighting other fellow Protestants. After putting up some resistance, the Württembergers broke and ran. This was followed by the Bavarians, who also weren't able to withstand the punishing assault. A contributing reason for this successful advance was the Prussian artillery arm. They were doing wonders here, following the infantry every step of the way and providing significant fire support. They set up a fresh battery here on Glansberg and had another one at a nearby hill. These 2 batteries rained destructive, murderous crossfire on the remaining Habsburg infantry of Nadeshdy's corps. The men found their ranks quickly diminishing, and seeing the Prussians heading towards them, they fled before contact had even been made. These units would try to reform and rally further back, but the Prussians, who were closely following them, prevented them from doing so, and they were routed. The last of Nadeshdy's infantry had fled the field. Meanwhile, Nadeshdy, to his credit, was aggressive with his cavalry and tried his best to outflank the Prussian right wing. However, the unexpected appearance of infantry in this sector, and the broken terrain featured here, not ideal for cavalry clashes, spoiled his strike. Outnumbered by Prussian cavalry, his troopers were gradually pushed back. But they gave a good account of themselves, launching spirited counterattacks that at moments stemmed the enemy's advance. In the end, superior numbers simply overwhelmed them. Nadeshdy's cavalrymen broke. This opened a path for cavalry to swoop in and take hundreds of prisoners that were fleeing north. In less than an hour, the entire Austrian left wing had effectively collapsed. By now, Charles was painfully aware that the main Schwerpunkt of the Prussians was to the south. Unless he planned on staying put and letting his line be rolled up 1 unit at a time, he needed to redeploy his entire formation, a full 90 degrees. He planned to reform just north of Leuthen, but in order to do this, he needed to buy time. He sent whatever units were at hand piecemeal to Leuthen to try to stop the Prussian advance. Elements of General Serbelloni's left-wing cavalry were the first attempted roadblock against the Prussian juggernaut. They bravely charged the Prussians, but were badly mauled for their effort. They were forced to withdraw, but it bought just enough time for the next batch of reinforcements to arrive. These were the 8 battalions of the reserve force who had done an about-face and double-timed it to Leuthen, and to their credit, arrived just before the Prussians entered the village. But they were winded and disorganized, and after heroically holding the line under murderous Prussian fire, were forced to retire north of the village. I am now walking towards Leuthen from the Prussian direction, and we will get to one of the most pivotal moments of the battle, the fight for the village itself. Close quarters combat occurs here, in house-to-house fighting. It's little wonder why most of the Prussian casualties suffered this day occurred in this stage of the battle. The main bastion of defense will be centered on the Leuthen Catholic Church, with its thick stone walls serving as a ready-made fortress. Ironically, the men who guard the church are fellow Germans. They are an elite unit, the Red Rossbachers, serving under Charles's army as auxiliaries. The fight for the churchyard that occurs here is exceptionally intense. Alright guys, as a history buff, this next shot has to be one of my favorites. I am standing from this epic painting's depiction of the fight for the church. There it is guys, the Leuthen church still stands with not much change to it. The Ruth-Würzburg regiment put up a courageous defense here against numerous Prussian assaults. Rebuffed several times, the Prussians finally made progress when they brought their artillery in and punched a hole in the wall. It's believed it occurred there. Also, the eastern gate was finally broken into, allowing 2 avenues of access into the church. The fall of the church to Prussian hands effectively marked the capture of the village. The Austrians had had time to reform a makeshift line. Thanks to their tough defense of Leuthen, they stood on good defensive ground and have formed a mass battery on their right. The Prussians attempted to charge headstrong at the Austrians, but were repulsed. The Prussian advance had finally run out of steam. Now they reformed, all the while taking punishing Austrian cannon fire, which began shattering the Prussian left. Frederick's next move would center on a small hill named Butterberg. Frederick ordered a battery to be set up here on this hill called Butterberg. I know, a very smooth name. From there, it had a perfect enfilade fire position onto the Austrians just north of Leuthen. However, upon assessing the situation, Frederick must have been worried. It's nearly 4 p.m. on a winter's day, night would soon come, and he still hasn't defeated the Austrian army. They remain on the field, staunchly holding their ground. Frederick needs to force a decision before the day is out. And, fortunately for him, he would soon get his wish. So we're back to where we started, here on Schonberg, and that's because the last act of the battle will take place here below us. The Austrians are going to attempt a bold move to steal back the initiative, their last draw of the dice. Right, so remember General Lucchesi, the right-wing commander, who with hindsight we can say played a major role for the current mess the Austrians were in, because he's the one that panicked and ordered the reserves to be sent north to him? Yeah, well, he's here, roughly in this area, and he's guarding the Austrian right flank again. His cavalry force is still intact. From his position, he saw the Prussian artillery there on Butterberg, and he noticed how vulnerable those guns were. Within his grasp is an opportunity to turn the tide of battle and a chance to redeem himself for his past mistake. He would charge across this land, hit the exposed guns, and then roll up the Prussian infantry from their left. At 4:30, he led 65 squadrons across this open ground. It is a great plan that had all the potential to succeed if it had not been for an unforeseen obstacle that lay over those hills. This whole time, there was a part of Frederick's force that had yet to be engaged. Concealed from Lucchesi's view because of the dead ground they were on, it was the left-wing cavalry under the steadfast, sharp-witted, and tough 57-year-old Lieutenant General von Driessen. He saw the coming cavalry charge and without missing a beat, ordered his 50 squadrons to counterattack. the Prussian cavalry struck Lucchese's vulnerable flank before they had reached the guns. It was a devastating blow, with Lucchese being killed in the opening moments. But his men impressively held their own and even threatened to gain the upper hand in the ensuing struggle. The balance was tipped when Prince Eugen of Württemberg and his reserve cavalry, also so far unengaged in this battle, joined the fight with 30 fresh Prussian squadrons. The resulting pincer attack proved too much, and the Austrian cavalry broke and fled the field, some running into their own infantrymen. Coinciding with this, the Prussian infantry on the right wing had marched forward in yet another determined assault. And also, the 4 battalions at Bornay, in charge of the earlier feint, began to advance as well. The Austrian army had reached its breaking point. They had had a rough opening to this battle, being caught flat-footed, and yet had somewhat admirably recovered. But by now they were shaken, demoralized, facing enfilading fire, and had an exposed flank that was under attack again. And now they were facing another determined Prussian assault. No army could withstand this much of a beating. Units gradually broke off and fled east until the whole army was soon in a disorderly retreat. The Austrian army had been defeated. Frederick personally assembled a vanguard force of cuirassiers and grenadiers to chase down the fleeing troops. However, darkness and the exhausted state of the Prussian troops saved the Austrian army from a more punishing pursuit. By 7 p.m., Frederick had reached the river crossing at Lisa, secured the bridge, and then sought accommodation at a nearby castle. Inside the schloss were some wounded Austrian soldiers, and Frederick warmly greeted them. He said, "Good evening, gentlemen. Certainly you weren't expecting me here." He then ironically asked his newfound prisoners if he could spend the night in the castle. Meanwhile, back at Leuthen, the victorious Prussian army settled themselves in for the night. Someone began to sing a familiar hymn, "Now Thank We All Our God." Spontaneously, the song caught on, and soon the entire army was in unison, singing the popular chorale. Indeed, the men had much to be grateful for. They had fought 2 battles, exactly a month apart, where they had been significantly outnumbered and had still triumphed in each. A fitting song to end a campaign as glorious as this. The Austrians lost 23,190 men, or 42% of their force, and 131 pieces of artillery. Despite winning, it had still come at a cost to the Prussians. They lost 16% of their force, 6,382 men. The Prussians pursued the remnants of the Austrian army to the outskirts of Breslau, taking a brief pause there to rest. Prince Charles left the garrison in the city and led what remained of his army out of Silesia and into Bohemia for winter quarters. Frederick placed Breslau under siege, and it surrendered on the 20th. Silesia was back in Frederick's hands. For the Austrians, the magnificent opening of their autumn offensive had been squandered in one afternoon in a set-piece battle against the Prussian king. The Habsburg army had entered Silesia back in September with about 90,000 men, and now only 20,000 remained fit for action. So I personally found this campaign fascinating because it featured all the principles of war that Frederick used. Strategically, Frederick worked best with the cards he was dealt. He made the most of using the advantage of interior lines to stave off defeat by engaging one enemy at a time. Rossbach and Leuthen were excellent examples of this. Tactically, we have the most famous use of the Oblique Order. It is often hailed as the secret trick Frederick had used to get the edge over his opponent. While yes, the Oblique Order contributed to his victory, it's not the sole reason he won. The main reason for this triumph is because of the flanking maneuver around the Austrians. Unleashing his grand assault on the enemy's vulnerable flank secured the win. The Oblique Order tactic just ensured the victory. Frederick did many things right, like adding the northern feint to his risky flanking maneuver, but we have to admit what helped Frederick the most was luck and an obliging enemy. As we saw, Frederick was never short on luck during this campaign. He didn't know the left flank was composed of the least reliable troops in the entire Habsburg army. He was also lucky his enemy was an obliging one, venturing out to fight him in the open field rather than sheltering behind the strong defenses of Breslau. And lest we forget, having his adversary choose his very own training ground of all places to fight this battle. Apart from bad luck, the Austrians did many things wrong. In fear of Frederick's tactics, they extended their line. But here was the irony. In order to defeat Frederick's feared flank attacks, you needed depth, not length. Regardless, they did good in creating a mobile reserve, but it was sent too early and in the wrong direction. But one of their biggest mistakes, and Frederick pointed this out after the battle, was the complete lack of a screen. Cavalry were the eyes and ears of an army at this time. Where were they? If we recall, they had taken the initial beating at Borny that morning and had escaped to friendly lines. Then they just stuck with Nadashi's cavalry for the rest of the battle. So, although they had regrouped, they had been so spiritually defeated by Frederick's superior cavalry that they did not dare to challenge them again. Even Frederick pointed out, had you had your cavalry, you would have discovered my movements and spoiled my attack. In the short term, the twin victories of Rossbach and Leuthen were the desperate revival Frederick needed at the time. Prussomania spread all over Europe, praising the triumph of Frederick's little army over two major powers of the continent. Frederick displayed wonderfully to the major powers that the Prussian army was still a force to be reckoned with. France never bothered threatening him with an army again, and for the Austrians, one can only imagine the disturbance and trauma left on their minds. Things had been going so well for them, then they suddenly meet this desperate, bold, high-spirited king, and in one afternoon, their entire strategic position changes. The fear of a Leuthen reoccurring again was surely forever in the back of the minds of many Austrian generals for the rest of the war. The war was not over, rough times laid ahead for Frederick, but in the end, Russia, then France, would drop out of the war, and an exhausted Austria would finally make peace in 1763. Silesia was confirmed his to keep.